all I could see was my beautiful son. The son I taught to make a broom, a fine broom, the way my father taught me. Papa would put his arms around me when he showed me how to tie the bundles around a wooden limb. Papa's arms were strong but tender. I could feel his warm breath on my neck and his steady voice talking me through each step. I talked to you with that same steady voice, soothed you when you were cutting bundles of sorghum, scraping the seeds off, hanging them to dry. Like Papa before me, I sang songs while we worked. I held my big hands around your little ones, and while we fastened a bundle, then make a quarter turn, and fasten another bundle over and over until the broom took shape. By the time I finished my first broom, my hands were blistered and my arms so tired, I thought they were going to fall off. But Papa told me,
don't ever let anybody see you cry. You hurt somewhere, you tell it to the broom.
After that first lesson, I talked to the broom all night long.
Can we get an accent there?
Yes. Just
That'll work. After that first lesson, I talked to the broom all night long.
Yeah.
So when I taught you to make a broom the same way my papa taught me, when your eyes were filled with tears and you looked like the blisters on your hands were going to pop open, I told you don't ever let anybody see you cry. But maybe I should have let you cry. Okay.
We actually do have to start. Oh, you do? Okay. Because we do want to try to start at 11:05. Oh, okay. It's like 3 minutes, okay? Yeah, 3 minutes is fine.
I'll get through it.
Yep.
Maybe I should listen to what you were telling the broom, that you wanted something else. When you were 7, you pulled one of the books off the shelf, the Livingstons, and brought it with you. Read to me, Papa. And I'd sit you on my lap and do that. And do that. By the time you were 10, you say, teach me to read. And I say, there's time for that later. Let's make some, I just have to change my boots. Yeah.
I need to, yeah.
You gotta get fully dressed. Okay.
Is there anything that you need with Shayshawn?
Just the, yeah. So we want to skip that? Okay, good. They took your mama to South Carolina yesterday.
Did you see that?
Yep.
And now I have more time than I ever wanted. Last day I saw you. You were holding your broom and flicking the ashes out of the fireplace with quick, short strokes.
Yeah, great. That's nice.
I watched you. Okay. Oh, that always gets me emotional.
Beautiful.
Wow.
Thank you, Shayshawn.
What?
I love the addition of the food.
I do too. It was like, it puts you in another place.
Oh, it's so beautiful.
Glad you like.
Yeah, and it really helps to differentiate between the
Colonial
colonial, the
and
house
the-
stuff, and then the African.
Yeah.
It's great.
That's great.
What's this in the very end though? The same thing or African singer sings, the drummer drums?
Oh, that's from the script. That's for the full-length show.
Oh, okay.
Forget that. Yeah. So at the end, what you guys are going to do, you'll start when he goes,
And I love you.
and I love you. This is what you're going to do. And I love you. You'll start playing.
On drums.
You'll
okay.
go and get Melissa. You'll come here. You guys, I'll start clapping. Let's start clapping. You'll bow. You'll play. Great. And then I'll come up stage and say we're going to have a 10-minute talk back with the artists. Yeah.
So just drumming in there.
Yes.
I'll probably play the same thing I started with.
Yes, please. Thank you. How did that seem? I mean, they're coming on for a funeral procession. Did it seem processional enough, or was it too happy? I mean, because they're bearing their
Well,
dead.
I can play what they play traditionally. They play lamba for like
Yeah, what's-
funerals. But it sounds happy. It seems happy because West African death is still happy.
Check 1 2. Mic check 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Mic check 1 2. Check 1 2. Mic check 1 2. 1 2. One, two, check, 1 2. Check 1. All right. All right. I just said something else. Just give it a few seconds.
Check, check, check. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Museum of the City of New York. Happy Black History Month. Woo-woo. We're going to get started in just 3 brief minutes, so just wanted to give you that heads up because you've been so patient. So just give us about 3 minutes, and we're going to get this party started, okay? Thank you for your time. So I have it here. Do you want to see this, Sarah? But we'd have to, go like this, right? And
Is this the panel one?
Yeah. So, because it's PDF.
This is 1 of 5.
Sorry, but the point is that it doesn't matter. We just need to get to a format that could be like with a clicker.
Cool.
So if you want to download it,
I was going to get to the internet, and I'll just download it on the desktop.
We have it, so you can just go now, make it happen.
Is the desktop fine?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. He's going to download the PowerPoint. Whenever he's done. And then we're going to... And then I'm going to come back.
So one is right here. So just click on this.
Yeah, so is it, can you just drag it on the desktop?
It should be on the desktop. Well, no, once I hit download, it went right to
Hold on, let me see something. So if I just minimize it and minimize this, they should be here, right?
It'll be in downloads.
Right here. Downloads. And like today. Just put them like right here. You can drag them. Could you drag them out so we know? Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I think it's set up onto automatic.
Okay, got it.
Stuff by date on them.
Okay, cool.
So we're
try
good?
it. Yeah, you're good. Thank you.
Cool.
We got it from here. Okay, so this one,
Yeah, PowerPoint to PDF.
this is 1 to 5. So we're going to start with this one, basically. So I'm going to open it in PowerPoint. So basically, the clicker should be working, right?
Yeah, it should be up. Should be fine. So let's see if that the remote is working.
How do you say view slideshow, right? Do you know how to...
What's
Oh, here. Boom.
Yeah, usually Command F, it does the full screen.
Okay, so I'm clicking,
Let's see.
and it's not working.
One second.
Okay, so why don't we get the show started and then do this afterwards? Just because we got to get started now. It's 11:23, and I want to stay on schedule. So we'll check this in between.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe you hold on to it, and we'll just do. Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Am I on? Is this all set? Okay. Good morning. We're all ready. All right. Hello and welcome to the Museum of the City of New York. And don't you guys look good today? Do you always look good, this good on a Saturday morning? My God. Well, thanks for putting it on for us today. So thank you again so much for joining us today at the Museum of the City of New York. Who here has been here before? And who's here today for the first time? Welcome! We hope you come back. So the Museum of the City of New York, to give you a sense of where you are, we celebrate and interpret the city. We educate the public about its distinctive character, especially its heritage of diversity, opportunity, and perpetual transformation. Ooh, that's good. Specifically, the Frederick A.O. Schwartz Children's Center at the museum, who's putting on this program today, serves over 46,000 children and adults each school year. We offer school programs, free after-school programs for high school students, and internships to young adults ages 18 to 23. We're founded in 1923 as a private, nonprofit corporation, and we'd like to think that our mission is to connect the past, the present, and the future of New York City. So, of course, this history includes the various Black communities who have helped to shape the growing metropolis we live in today. And today, we're going to honor those New Yorkers and the legacies they have paved for future generations. My name is Dominique Jean-Louis. I'm an educator here at the Frederick A.O. Schwartz Center. I'm also a historian of Black New York, and so I'm so excited to bring the programming we have to you today. You guys are in for a real treat. And because you're in for a real treat, we have some people to thank for making that possible. So first off, we'd like to thank Whitney W. Donhauser. She's our Rone Menschel director of this museum. Franny Kent, who's the VP of Education here at the museum. And we'd also like to thank all of our generous funders who have helped to make this program possible. And that includes the Lone Pine Foundation, Lewis Wiley Jr., and the Milton and Salary Avery Arts Foundation. We'd like to thank the Frederick A.O. Schwartz Education Center, which specifically is endowed by grants from the Thompson Family Foundation Fund, the F.A.O. Schwartz Family Foundation, and the William Randolph Hearst Endowment, as well as other generous donors. So if we can give them a round of applause for helping us put on this program today. So in terms of what we have up for today, we have some great events that you guys are going to join us for. So we're going to start with a performance by the American Slavery Project, followed by a panel about Black communities of early New York. It's going to be moderated by our curator, Sarah Seidman. We'll introduce her in a moment. And at 12:50, we're actually all going to be exiting this space. So there's going to be additional programming happening elsewhere in the museum. We're going to be setting up for our community fair here. So you guys will have a mapping activity with the Studio Museum in Harlem in our classroom spaces, as well as a scavenger hunt, which you can get information for on our first floor. So we're going to be exiting the space right before 1 o'clock, and then we'll be able to come in afterwards for more programming. So lots going on today. We hope you're excited as we are to get this going. So to get it started, we're going to be starting with a performance by the American Slavery Project. The ASP is a theatrical response to the increasing revisionism in American discourse around slavery, which basically means we're learning new things about what slavery looked like in New York City and across this country all the time. We're constantly getting new information, and this is a way to engage with that new information through dance and through performance. So their mission is to showcase African American writers who write about this era, to create conversation in the community, and present educational workshops in schools and neighborhoods. What we're going to be seeing today are two monologues from ASP's original theater piece, Unheard Voices. Unheard Voices was created by a collective of award-winning African-American playwrights commissioned to study colonial New York, and specifically the burials at the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan. So this African Burial Ground is a really interesting part of our city's history that we're really excited to have you engage with today. So it was rediscovered 20 years ago when 419 bodies of African-descended people were unearthed during an excavation for a federal office building in downtown Manhattan. It was originally open from 1690 to 1790, was situated outside of New York City limits, and holds nearly 30,000 bodies, which is kind of incredible that 20 years ago we found this amazing repository of history and life that was previously undiscovered. There are no extant records of who was buried at this African burial ground, so we don't know the specific lives and the texture of their lives of these people that we found. But what the ASP writers have done is we imagine their daily lives based on the contents of each grave, and they've tried to give them a story. So today, we're going to hear a piece called Child's Grave by Cassandra Medley, and it's based on burial number 44, and it's performed by Melissa Murray Much. It's the story of a 6-year-old child who longs for a doll thrown into a fire. And you'll hear a letter from a free black man to his enslaved son in Sweep by Judy Tate, based on burial number 11, performed by Lawrence Floyd. These performance pieces give voice to a moment in time that might have been, and pay homage to the African descendant individuals who toiled, who loved, laughed, endured, and lived ordinary lives in what we look back on as extraordinary times. So please help me in welcoming the ASP, the American Slavery Project.
Dirty, but you mine. You mine. Your neck broke. Isabel, little mistress, throw you into the fire. I pull you out. I get big burn. She laugh. She get big slap and throw you back in to catch fire. Dolly, you burn black in the flame. Little mistress, laugh and laugh and laugh. Me keep quiet. Me keep eyes down low, like my Betsy do. Dolly, my bet, she be from way, way, way across the water. And she know the old wise ways real good. Dolly, me stand all day with me with the spindle like this. All day long you dress, you body burn and your face burn black. My bet spin the spinning wheel and I hold the spindle. Hand hurt, arm hurt, but me watch you face black up. My bet watch too, but she nod to me to keep shush. This time I do what she tell me. Big mistress, come and say,
My bet, you lazy thing. You'll see the sun setting. You haven't yet started the family meal. Ox! You'll get to cooking before I get to strop. Master, get back and you ain't got no dinner boiling on this fire. You get the double strop. See if you don't.
My bet, jump, grab the iron kettle, start greasing it up. And the same thing she do with the poker, she sneak quiet and brush you to the side of the ash. Yes, Dolly, my bet she did. Well, only thing left of you be your burnt crisp head. But still she do it. You, Dolly, all you is left is you burnt black head with no hair. But you mine, you all mine. You live in my secret place here. Only my bet know you all mine. No slaps for you. No grabbing, no shake, no holler make you tremble. You mine. And me no call you what they call us in this place. You be all a burnt black head, but I get to hold you 3 whole days at the Pinka Day. And then I put you back in the secret place. And when these Dutch go to church, I pull you out and give you a scrap, same as we. Dolly, my bet tell me you my gree-gree. Me best luck. She say you keep me good safe. My bet say me when the slaps come across my face, you be tucked safe in our secret place. So you can do my crying for me. Dolly, she right. Dolly, me grow up, me keeping you with me. Any man want me to be wife, he best like my gree-gree, my best friend. He best say you burnt black head be pretty, too. This man when I grow big. Dolly, maybe you see way more than these here Dutch. Maybe you see all the way clear to when freedom gon' come. You, me, Dolly.
February 10th, 1712. Dear Juniper, just before dawn, I brought my favorite broom down to these docks, and I swept. I swept, and I swept until nothing was left and I couldn't move my arms anymore. Then I sat down and tied this letter to my broom.
Love in life and anything worth having starts with a broom.
It's what my papa taught me and what I taught you. You roll your eyes, but I ask you, how'd your mama become my wife? Jumping a broom. After the British outlawed slaves from dancing, how'd she learn to reel? By swaying her hips to music in her head and holding on tight to the handle of a broom. And how did your mama teach you right from wrong? By whacking your backside with the business end of a broom. I loved your mama to death. Probably should have never fallen in love with her. Didn't mean to fall in love with her. The Livingstons own her fully, not even half free, but she was gentle and kind. and the prettiest things I'd ever laid eyes on. I needed somebody tender in my life, a family to balance out all the hardwood and straw. And I knew if I had children with her, they wouldn't be free on account of her situation, but I just couldn't help the feeling I got every time I ring the doorbell at the Livingston Manor, and a pretty smile was grinning back at me. I think I sold that family a dozen brooms just so I could see her eyes twinkling in the sunlight. So we jumped the broom, and every Sunday your mama would get a day off to come see me, her husband, the broom maker. She liked to tell people that. She was proud of me, and I was proud that I could give her something to hold her head up about. Your mama says those were the happiest days of her life. And they were mine too. And then when you came along, well, you could have knocked us both over with a feather, or maybe a whisk broom. See, for me, a broom isn't just a broom. A broom can show you who people are. If a chambermaid holds her broom too tight, she's afraid she's going to lose her man. If a chimney sweep flicks ashes from the edge of the fireplace with quick little strokes, I know he's thinking about running up into Canada. But when I saw you and looked at you holding a broom that you just finished making, all I could see was my beautiful son. The son I taught to make a fine broom the way my father taught me. See, Papa would put his arms around me when he showed me how to tie the bundles around a wooden limb. Papa's arms were strong but tender, and I could feel his warm breath on my neck and his steady voice talking me through each step. I talked to you with that same steady voice, soothed you when we were cutting bundles of sorghum, scraping the seeds off, hanging them to dry. And like Papa before me, I sang songs while we worked. I held my big hands around your little hands. And we'd fasten a bundle, then make a quarter turn and fasten another bundle over and over and over until the broom took shape. By the time I finished my first broom, my hands were blistered and my arms so tired, I thought they were going to fall off. But Papa told me,
don't ever let anybody see you cry. You hurt somewhere, you tell it to the broom.
After that first lesson, I talked to that broom all night long. So when I taught you to make a broom the same way my Papa taught me, when your eyes were filled with tears and you looked like the blisters on your hands were going to pop open, I told you don't ever let anybody see you cry. But maybe I should have let you cry. Maybe I should have listened to you, to what you were telling the broom, that you wanted something else. When you were 7, you pulled one of the books off the shelf at the Livingstons and brought it with you. You said, read to me, Papa. And I'd sit you on my lap and I'd do that. By the time you were 10, you'd say, teach me to read. And I said, there's time for that later. Let's make some brooms together. I could use the extra hands. But what did I know? I'm a free man, born to a free woman who was born to a free woman before her. And to a free man, there's always more time. I guess there's no way I could know how different you saw the world. Being taught the art of broom making by a Papa who could go hither and yon when you couldn't. Stay out as long as he wanted when you couldn't. Buy a house of his own when you... Then before I knew it, you were 12 and saying,
Papa, buy me and Mama so we can live here all together.
You got a better life here at the Livingstons.
But we ain't legal to you.
You cried back. The broom will take care of it. I said, I make the best brooms in the city. And one day I'll have saved enough to pay the Livingston the 200-pound tax on top of the price for both you and your mama. Wait until then. Wait. You could live your whole life waiting. So, by the time you were 17 and the Livingstons announced they were moving to South Carolina to stake their wealth in trade there and were taking you and your mama with them, I guess you couldn't wait anymore. Your mama searched in secret for a full week before she finally marched to my house, crying and screaming and shouting about how you run off into Canada with those Indians. You could be dead or worse, burned at the stake. Soon I'd be sweeping up my own son's ashes. She screamed what a selfish, prideful man I'd been.
If you can read somebody holding a broom, how is it you never taught your own son to read? Now he's out there somewhere, defenseless, with nothing in his head but how to make a damn broom.
She said I was no better than the Livingstons, making my work and my money and my precious brooms more important than my wife and my son. I told her everything I'd done for you, for her. But it made no difference. She picked up this very broom and started to beat me hard. That gentle woman beat me long and hard, and I didn't raise a hand to defend myself. What could I defend? I stood there, arms wide open, while she flailed at me with the handle of my own broom. And when she was spent, we folded into each other's arms. And the tears on our faces mixed in together, and we fell asleep, weeping. They took your mama to South Carolina yesterday. And now I have more time than I ever wanted. Last day I saw you. You were holding your broom and flicking the ashes out of the fireplace with short, quick strokes. I saw you do that. But I didn't see what you were saying to me. I didn't see you crying. I wrote you this letter, tied it to this broom, and now I'm going to float the broom and dream that it finds its way to you. And when it does, you'll be able to read it. And remember that wherever you are, you're a broom maker's son. And I love you.
Hello. Shayshawn McPherson on the drums, everybody. And the fiddle. $5 minutes. Larry Floyd, who did that incredibly moving monologue. and Melissa Marie Much, who is one of our teaching artists who goes into the schools and does this work with young people who go through the same process as the professional people did. And we have shows performed by professional actors for young people who want to do the same kind of research and learn how to write a monologue, and they can create their own version of Unheard Voices. So we only have about 5 minutes, but is there anything that you want to, what stood out for you? What stood out for you? If you were going to tell somebody about this tomorrow, what would you say? Yes. Oh, the seriousness of it. Give me what struck you? That the broom meant so much. Yeah, she was saying that she didn't realize that. I'm going to repeat because the people behind you can't hear what you're saying forward, right? That she never realized that the broom meant so much, that and where jumping the broom came from, and that there was so much symbolism in the broom. Thank you. Anybody else? Is anybody have things that stood out or questions to ask? Yes.
I have a question to ask you to
Actors, yes. Yeah.
Melissa, you go first, please.
Well, doing monologues, it's not just, you want to basically know how we work on the monologue. What does it mean to us? The meaning of the monologue. Yeah. Whenever, as actors, we approach something, it's never words on the paper. There's a story underneath the words. And what I really loved about this particular monologue, it was a child, and it was a child who wanted a doll, even though it was basically burnt. She says it's burnt black. And to me, what does that say to you? This child that wants that thing so badly. What does it say to you?
Especially about that time.
Especially in that time. Like, what would it say to you? For me, it would say that she has nothing. She doesn't live a life like a normal little girl. She doesn't have a birthday party. There aren't people giving her gifts. She works. That little girl works. And when she says, I stand and hold that thing all day, does she get a bathroom break? Does she get to go to the bathroom? And another thing, she's slapped a lot. She helps the little mistress. So she's like the little mistress's personal slave. So she doesn't get to have a life. And even that burnt up doll is so meaningful. Like, if I can just have that little thing, I just have that one thing. She has nothing.
Well, for me, I love doing. Judy actually wrote that. Oh Lord, okay. Judy actually wrote this, so I've been doing it a while now. But for me, it's something I also teach. So it's like when you look at the monologue and you realize, because is there anyone here? You know what I'm saying? Most of us, we read in some form, so we don't think of how important education, for me as a teacher, how important education is to survival. I mean, you just say, okay, they're thinking we want to read so we can get, but it is key to survival. And there are so many things, especially in this age of, I'll say it this way, because we all at some point feel like we're not from here. So in an age where we're basically all immigrants to this country, in some form or another, that you feel like this is what you come here for. This is what you pass on. This is what you know. As an actor, education is deep. So for us, it is necessary. And then to think that someone didn't have that, you know what I mean? Just that little thing. Our 21st century sensibilities can't acknowledge that, but it's deep. And also the classes. You get the free man, but even if he married a woman who's a slave, the child wasn't free. You know what I mean? It's his child, but it's not free. So, I mean, just those little things. For me, I think about, and it makes me kind of sad. So every time I go through it, I'm like, oh, shoot, I got to go through this again. But it was a reality, so that's it.
Okay, anybody? Yes.
Hopefully it's not too far in the weeds. But the first one is how many people are, how many actors do you have, how many writers do you have?
When we started this project in 2012, I commissioned 17 writers. We have 3 versions of the show. We have a full-length evening version that's about 70 minutes. We have a 1-hour version and a 45-minute middle school version. We also have a version of the show that's all voices of children because half of the bodies, there's somewhere between 20 and 30,000 bodies in the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan. And so half of those are children. So we have a 45-minute version that's children. Okay, yes. Yeah, and these, so once we commissioned the monologues, we studied the era. We brought in people from the African burial ground. We brought in historians and people who were well-versed in the history of enslavement and colonial New York. And so we studied the era, and then they chose burials that they wanted to write to. And when we do the full-length show, you're always aware we have something like one of these posters, but you're always aware of which burial you're listening to and who that person might have been and the contents of the grave. Yeah, yes. One more question. Yes? He said, great job. Thank you. Oh, can we keep it about, not just in life, yeah, can we keep it about American Slavery Project and this particular thing you saw, as opposed to the hardest monologue you ever had to perform in life?
Yeah, I think earlier, I just, in terms of this child, just wanting something that she just doesn't have. She can never have, and she's observing the little mistress life, and she doesn't have that life. She has to work all the time. And so, imagining that, like not having, just wanting this one little thing and not being able to have it.
For me, it's just about the unknown. It's like, will he ever see his son again? Will I ever see the son again? Will I ever be reunited with my wife? Like all those things all the bad things that could happen. That you have to sort of throw in there. But I think that's, as you go through it and experience, that's, in my mind, that's what I see. You know what I mean? That's hard for me.
Well, I'm told that we have to wrap up. Are there any educators in the audience? Educators? Great. Your seat had a brochure on it. Take our brochure if you're interested in finding out any more of what we do. Our website is on that brochure. My information is on that brochure, and we will have a table during that part of this afternoon. So enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience.
Thank you. Are we good?
Try this one.
Oh, there we go. All right. So as that performance was going on, I love the way that they were talking about the tools that we use in our lives and how much meaning gets put into the tools that we spend every day with, the broom and the objects in our lives, these tools that help us live our life. And then in the talk back, we got to hear a little bit about how these performers, their emotions and their experience and their history becomes the tools that they use to do their job. And thinking again about tools, I mentioned I'm a historian of African American history here in New York City, and I started to think about the tools that a historian uses and how those look so different from a broom or from these emotional stories, but they're still what lets us live our lives, lets us do our work. And so to think a little bit more about the tools of a historian and how these stories help us understand the city that's around us, we're now going to go into a panel about the Black communities of early New York. Who are doing the work of historians. Our panelists are using those historical tools to make these stories come alive. So this conversation will be moderated by Dr. Sarah Seidman in conversation with Dr. Preeti Kanakamadala, Kamau Ware, and Dr. Deborah Gray White. So Sarah Seidman, who will be moderating this conversation, is the Puffin Foundation Curator of Social Activism here at the Museum of the City of New York. She curates the ongoing exhibition Activist New York and has also curated Beyond Suffrage and King in New York at the museum, which you can see on the second and third floors here today. She holds a PhD in American Studies and an MA in Public Humanities from Brown University and a BA in American Studies from Wesleyan University. Her research centers around questions of political culture, race, and social movements in the United States and around the world. She has received fellowships from the University of Rochester, New York University, and the American Council of Learned Societies, and her writing has appeared in the Journal of Transnational American Studies and the 60s, a journal of history, politics, and culture, among other places. So I hope you'll join me in giving a warm welcome to our panelists and our moderators.
Dominique, and thank you all for being here on a Saturday. It's so exciting to see so many new and old faces. So I'm Sarah Seidman, as Dominique said, the Puffin Curator of Social Activism at the museum, and I'm really excited to be moderating this exciting conversation today with our esteemed panelists and to connect it to the exhibitions that I work on and to, as someone who does like the 20th century, to learn more about the past. So I will introduce our panelists and then we will dive in. Dr. Preeti Kanakamadala specializes in the Black Atlantic during the long 19th century, including New York's free Black communities. She has published on a number of topics, including Black identity in the 19th century transatlantic performance culture, New York's cultural heritage, and the labor history of the Brooklyn Bridge. She is a committed public historian and served as historian and curator for In Pursuit of Freedom, a partnership of the Brooklyn Historical Society, Weeksville Heritage Center, and Irondale Ensemble Project, which traces Brooklyn's anti-slavery movement. She received her PhD in Atlantic Studies from the University of Sussex, England, and is originally from Liverpool, England. So welcome. Dr. Kamau Ware, doctor of, many things, I'm sure, is a Brooklyn-based visual artist born in Pittsburgh. His work focuses on visual storytelling by using photography, history, and fantasy to produce moving narratives about people and spaces. His works include America, the Legacy of African American Legacy, Inside Black Gotham, and Bed-Stuy Story, among others. His residencies and awards include LMCC's Process Space Program and History in Action Project, and of course Black Gotham. He received a BS from the University of Pittsburgh, so welcome. And last but certainly not least, Deborah Gray White. Dr. Deborah Gray White is the Board of Governors Professor of History and Professor of Women and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. During her 26 years at Rutgers, she has been a teacher, a co-director of the Black Atlantic Race, Nation, and Gender Project, a research professor at the Institute for Research on Women, chair of the History Department. She is the author of the groundbreaking Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South, which has been re-released and much heralded, as well as many other publications such as Telling Histories, Black Women Historians in the Ivory Tower, and Too Heavy a Load, Black Women in Defense of Themselves. Welcome. All right, so we are going to dive in. Thanks. Okay, so welcome again. after giving your kind of formal bios, I'd love to hear from each of you, a little bit more about your work in African American history, really how you came to work on Black communities, in the 19th century or in early America, be it in New York City or beyond. So, Prithvi, why don't we start with you?
Hi, good morning, everyone. So I came in a kind of circuitous route in the same way I think that my story starts. So when I was growing up in England, I listened to my elders and my ancestors and the stories of British colonialism and sort of global histories. And more formally, I started learning about the Atlantic slave trade in school when I was about 13, 14. And when I got to college, I started reading an amazing scholar, Paul Gilroy's ideas of these oceans as carrying not just sort of geographical roots, but also thinking about a kind of solidarity and cultural practices, which carries our heritage, our roots. So I always looked at the Black Atlantic. That's really my scholarly background. And when I moved to New York over a decade ago, I became very interested in New York's Black communities, specifically their free Black communities. And so, yeah, that's how I sort of ended up in this area.
Is it good morning time or good afternoon? All right, thanks. Had to check. Good afternoon. Proud to see all your faces. I got involved in Black history, one from just being like a nerdy person who loves history, loves comics, and so I was just a person who was always geeking out on both of those two things. And I have like this kind of synesthesia where if I read something that might be nonfiction, I can like see it in my head like a comic or see it like a movie. And so I've always enjoyed reading history because there's like the best movies that you can get is, the truth or like the actual events. And I found myself in New York 2006, and I began working at a museum in the Lower East Side. Some of you may be familiar with it. Anybody here been to the Tenement Museum, Lower East Side? Just by a quick show of hands. I was one of the educators there for about 3 or so years. And if anybody here, just by a quick show of hands, who here is like in middle school? Anybody here in middle school? Beautiful. So what happened to me is in 2008, I was working as an educator, and most of the people who lived in a tenement are primarily European history, Jewish, Italian, Irish, and I was having lots of great conversations about the immigrant experience from the European perspective. And somebody that was in middle school once on the Monday school program just challenged me in a very subtle but powerful way. She was quiet the entire conversation we had for 90 minutes about immigrant history in New York. But then once the tour was over, she very quietly, respectfully raised her hand and asked me where the Black people were, which was not part of the conversation that was happening at the museum. And I feel like I was just saved from complete embarrassment by having done my own research. And then I thought that it'd be nice if there was a way for there to have, more conversations about the Black experience in Europe, like other institutions were having about European history. And that's really how I got involved in taking my love of history and also art. And now we do walking tours and graphic novels that celebrate the Black impact on New York City.
Well, good afternoon. I am pleased to say that I was born and raised in Manhattan. And when I went to school, there was no Black history. We were not in the history books. We had Black History Week, not Black History Month. So as I look around this audience, I see that there's some people who are from my era, and then there are others who have no idea of what it used to be like. So when I went to school, I actually got involved in African American history by being a part of the demonstrations that brought African American history to just at first the colleges and then to the textbooks. So that I can say very proudly that I'm a child of the 60s, and that some of those demonstrations on campus were not just about the war in Vietnam, but they were about bringing more African Americans to campus, and they were also about bringing African American history and African American studies departments when I went to, and by the way, I went to Binghamton University, part of the State University of New York. So when I decided to go to graduate school, it was how I got involved in history, and it was basically because I had a high school teacher who just introduced me to just history, period. And I went to Julia Richmond High School, which is not far from here, in fact, down on the east side. The text, there was no Black history. And not only was I one of the very first PhDs in the modern era to graduate with a PhD in African American history, but we basically had to break into the profession and to make the profession understand that Black people did have a history. It was a history that could be done not only by whites but also by African Americans. So I chose a topic which was about African American female slaves, and I guess the rest of that it got published with great difficulty later on, many years later, in a book called Aren't I a Woman? And today it is still a bestseller on the history textbook list.
Great, thank you. So, since we have such a repository of knowledge here, I want to just dive in and ask you all to tell us a bit more about the Black communities of early New York, and to tell us about what we know about them, what we might not know about them. Of course, how these histories have been either uncovered or preserved, or lost sometimes.
I think the one thing that's really interesting about looking at New York specifically is understanding the situation that the island is in geographically in the world, and how this has been a fought over port city by a range of different empires, and to understand that the Black bodies that have been on this island have always seen these major epic sweeps. And slavery is not a singular experience. You have to look at sometimes by the year, the decade, the century, the empire, the commodity, to really begin to understand the complexity. And one thing that I've always found very interesting about the Black experience here in New York is how much it's been ambiguous often what it means to be enslaved in New York in comparison to how we often visualize slavery. And so there's a lot of rich, powerful stories that you can draw a lot of insight on if you begin to actually look at the people who walk the streets and not think about slavery as one experience, or even approach it from the vantage point that everybody is a slave. Slaves aren't born. Slavery is a condition. I think considering people being enslaved gives them a lot more agency and gives you a lot more insight if you don't look at them from a stagnant position as everybody that is in New York that's Black is a slave, so to speak. And so just to kind of keep it somewhat brief to share the conversation, I think that the first groups that you look at that are walking the streets of New York, going back to the time of New Netherlands, New Amsterdam, a lot of them are first coming off of pirate ships of people who were not enslavers. And the Dutch, of course, are going to get more involved in the slave trade, but at the time of finding this island, for their purposes, they were at war at that point in time against major slave traders, the Spanish and the Portuguese. And so the Black people that were first here are in a space that's not very defined as you're my property. And they had agency, and they did a lot of things that give us insight, even to situations that we're in right now, like how they work together. And so I think that it's important to just look past the way sometimes people contextualize the Black experience and realize how much is there.
Yeah, I want to set the scene slightly. So our story begins really in 1626, and none of this is here, right? Everything north of Houston looks incredibly natural. Thinking about hills and trees and rivers and stuff. So really the story starts in Lower Manhattan, what the Dutch would call New Amsterdam. And it's in 1626 when we have 11 enslaved Africans who come to Manhattan to start working for the Dutch West India Company, which is essentially the equivalent of like Apple or Nike setting up and taking over land and saying, you're going to work for us. And I just want to mention that 2 years later, there are 3 women of African descent who join them. So it is very much a story of both men and women both struggling and finding moments of freedom in early New York. By 1644, what Kamal was talking about was they'll find their freedom, a kind of half freedom, because they will negotiate, like all people negotiate with companies, to really secure a kind of hope and a kind of freedom for themselves in which they can work and live on their own land. And much prior to that, there have been other people of color in Manhattan. There was Juan Ollan Rodriguez, who comes way before 1626. He comes from what is today the Dominican Republic. And again, his story is couched in a kind of freedom and half freedom. And he comes to basically trade fur. So I think these stories, as Kamal was saying, are deeply rooted in this island. And I think it's just really important to kind of celebrate. As much as there was pain, there was joy. As much as there was freedom, there was unfreedom. And it becomes really the story of New York.
Well, if I can add to that, I'm not a specialist in New York, but basically sort of a generalist when it comes to slavery. And just to illuminate some of the things you said, first of all, every black person did not speak the same language, and it's hard to think of African Americans as a community. Basically, you have some people who are going to be speaking Spanish. There's some people who are going to be speaking Dutch. You're going to have some people who are going to be speaking English. And the idea that they made a community is something that's really hard for us in the 21st century to understand, because each one is coming from their own background. It is really over time, as blackness gets developed as not only a class, but as a caste, that the community begins to develop. Because blackness is really imposed on African Americans rather than them coming together, oh, you're black, and so we and I speak the same language. You know, just building on also what you said, that there are other kinds of unfree people here. Not all black people are enslaved and not all white people are free. And so in some ways there's much more fluidity, which also meant that there's a lot of sex across the races as well. There's a lot of, there's some, let's not even call it intermarriage, but there certainly is a lot of people who are making their way, and the lines of race are really not yet solidified.
And Deborah, would you say, in thinking about early African immigrants or migrants or enslaved people, various ways that people come to the U.S., beyond New York, like do those histories look really different? I'm sure, like you said, there's so many different histories, not one story, but
there's so many different histories, and in our heads, and one of the things that historians used to believe, and that is really changing, is that, say, the southern colonies look so much different from the northern colonies. But that's just not really the case. I mean, clearly each one of the southern colonies has its own history. Whether you're looking at South Carolina, where most of the enslaved as well as most of the colonists come from Barbados. Whereas, say, New England, most of the colonists are coming from England. And, you know, you got the whole Puritan story, et cetera. But the land is not settled, and everybody's got to work. And so work is sort of the great equalizer. And, you know, it's easy to think, well, oh, slavery in the city must have been so much easier than slavery in the rural areas. Because, first of all, we're not even dealing with cotton at this point. We're really dealing with rice, and we're really dealing with tobacco down south. But quite frankly, it was different. Slowly but surely, as the 1600s move into the 1700s, and the 1700s move into the 1800s, black life is patrolled and surveilled. And that happens over time in every single area. In every single area, there is a different way of surveilling and patrolling black life, but black life gets to be circumscribed. And while it's circumscribed in a way in New York so that you'll find the jail is probably going to be full of dark-skinned people, the jail in South Carolina, where, you know, in some of the cities, they're going to look pretty much the same as in New York. So I would just say that let's not get it into our heads that slavery in the cities was so much easier, better. I would say that slavery in the cities was different, but it was still slavery.
Thank you. I'd love to hear more, you know, in keeping that in mind about there are so many different stories and that these histories do change over time. I'd love to hear, you know, some of the stories of early black communities in New York, individuals, groups, you know, where did they live? What were their lives like once they got here? And what are the sites and spaces of the city that we can, you know, learn more about these histories? We've heard, you know, a little bit about the African burial ground downtown. So tell us more.
Okay, cool. Yeah, 827, perfect. I think there's something that's critical for people to slow down a little bit on the timeline is to look specifically at 1664 and how much things are going to change with that transaction between the Dutch and the English. And also would you understand that to be, you know, New Amsterdam or to be Dutch wasn't like you were one singular race either. I often ask people to consider what it means to be an American now, how you can have different ethnicities but still all be American or an American citizen. But when you look at the Netherlands, a lot of people are leaving different European countries because the Netherlands is more tolerant or accepting of people of different religions. And so you have people that are settling here in New Amsterdam. When I say New Amsterdam, Netherlands, the difference is New Netherlands like the area, like the state, so to speak. New Amsterdam is Wall Street down. And the reason why that's important to have a distinction that also would include like black communities that are outside of Wall Street past New Amsterdam that also are building community what is now like East and West Village. So that's why I make the distinction between New Amsterdam and New Netherlands. But I think it's important to understand that when the English do take New Netherland and they name it after James Stewart, who is not the king yet, but he's the Duke of York, is that he and his older brother, Charles II, have created a slave trading company. And the reason why they're taking the island is because it's so well situated, close to the Atlantic Ocean, protected by Long Island, to give you this very large river where their ships can dock and it can get to the West Indies quickly. And so it's really seen as a commercial hub for the slave trade, for their company. And so from the very beginning that New York gets started, it's named after a person who is a slave trader, not a king. And the people who have been able to find ways of building community and have a sense of freedom are going to watch this place that has a lot of their labor invested in it become a commercial hub for the beginning of the English transatlantic slave trade. And so just begin to imagine from an empathetic standpoint what it's like to walk down Wall Street, to walk down Broadway, to walk around a town where perhaps your forebears or your parents have been able to negotiate their freedom, but now you're watching the whole idea of you becoming free is a lot more complicated. It's kind of like, well, I don't know about the way the Dutch were thinking about slavery, but from our vantage point, you're not getting out of it. That's right. And so that's a very important thing to consider about how New York is changing. And I think it's also worth looking at the quintessential element of New York are ethnic neighborhoods. In the moment that New York becomes New York in September 9th, 1664, that potentially the first large ethnic neighborhood of New York is this black community that began to establish in the 1640s. And so very much like the drumbeat of New York soul, as far as being a New Yorker, negotiating, being nice, but being tough, sticking together, throwing shade when necessary, but also giving directions to the bodega, whatever you want to call it. Those elements of being, a community that works together, that started from the very beginning with these kind of black communities that were forming that come from different parts of the world, but primarily from Angola and the Congo. And so when you think about the sites and the locations, it's also worth considering about the psychic space that also is a part of New York. And I think a lot of the value that black people have brought to this country, to this island, to this city is not only in the built environment of building Broadway or Wall Street or building forts, but it's the mentality of working together to defy power for freedom's sake.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to fast forward the timeline slightly. So you have this huge thing, the American Revolution, that happens in 1775 and finishes up in 1783, in which the terrible British are kicked out. And of course, we know that American Revolution does not bring freedom to everybody. And so that's really where the story of free black communities begins, right? In 1799, New York State passes that completely convoluted Gradual Emancipation Act that does nothing for enslaved people, but does everything for slaveholders, in which they say if you're born to an enslaved mother post July 4th, 1799, you'll be free at the age of 28 if you're male, and free at the age of 25 if you're female, right? Completely thinking about people as labor, as something that can help capitalism grow in this city. And so I like to think about, especially when I teach in my classroom up in the Bronx, what we think about a lot is people of color and people of African descent specifically weren't waiting for freedom to come to them. They were absolutely getting different ways to get at freedom themselves, and they were grabbing emancipation. And so historians talk about gradual emancipation. It takes 28 years for New York State to abolish slavery. It's the second to last northern state to do so. And during that time, African Americans, people of African descent, are finding ways to grow their communities. They're establishing their own churches, they're establishing their schools, and they're living in neighborhoods that we walk across all the time today. I always say to people, the best way to think about it is we are buried on top of ancestors and their stories. And so they live in neighborhoods that we know today as kind of Chinatown, going into Little Italy, if you're thinking about Manhattan. They live in neighborhoods, if you're from Brooklyn. Anybody from Brooklyn? Awesome. If you're in Brooklyn, they live in, before Starbucks and West Elm and Pier imports went into Dumbo, there was actually a thriving free black community that lived in Dumbo, Vinegar Hill, downtown Brooklyn, and then they will branch out. And of course, post-1827, you have two remarkable free black communities. It's such a sort of quintessential New York story. You have Seneca Village in what is today Central Park, and you have Weeksville, which is out in Brooklyn, which is such a magical story in itself because it tells you such a different story of the black experience. And if any of you have been to Weeksville Heritage Center, you know the kind of magic that comes out of there. Weeksville, of course, is incredibly important to New York's story because it was the largest amount of landowners in any free black community in the United States, and it was the second largest free black community in the pre-Civil War period. So I would urge you, especially if you're still in school, to ask those educators to start teaching you about Seneca Village and about Weeksville. And of course, you can still visit Weeksville Heritage Center. And I just wanted to give a shout out, I don't mean to embarrass her, but the former executive director and one of the custodians of this remarkable history, Ms. Pam Green, is actually sat here today. So yes, ask your teachers.
Again, I'm the generalist here, so I'm not really an expert on New York history, but there are a couple of things that went through my mind when you guys were talking, and one of them is you said that 1664 was a very important year, but also I think it's 1676. Let's just say the 1670s because you can always Google what year Bacon's Rebellion happened, and I think that a lot of when you get to school and they talk about Bacon's Rebellion, they tell you about Nathaniel Bacon and how he was this guy who really wanted to improve himself. He was a white man, and he marched on the House of Burgesses, and he literally led a rebellion. And during this time, the rebellion was groups of blacks and whites who were poor, and this is in Virginia, But the House of Burgesses took real great notice of this particular rebellion because they didn't like the idea that you had a class war here going on, because the House of Burgesses really represented the rich people, and what Nathaniel Bacon wanted, he wanted land. He wanted land out west, not like Wyoming or anything, but just in a little bit west of the Atlantic Ocean. And what he did was he gathered a lot of poor white men, a lot of indentured who were indentured servants or people who were free, as well as black slaves and in black indentured servants. And when the House of Burgesses took notice of this, they said, wait a minute, black and white together? Rebelling? Class warfare? We've got to break this up. Right after, the House of Burgesses met, etc., and they decided that, okay, we have a labor problem. And with this labor problem, you have all of these very poor people, both blacks and whites. Also, they wanted to make sure that they kept getting a steady stream of white immigrants. Well, you can't be over in England and hearing how bad things are for immigrants over in America and actually decide that you're going to make that journey across the ocean in ships that still look like the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Whatever. So they made a very crucial decision, and this is a decision that spread throughout the colonies. In order to make the lives of indentured servants better, white indentured servants, they had to make somebody do all of the work. So right after Bacon's Rebellion, the fortunes of white indentured servants improved, but the fortunes of African Americans decreased. In other words, it is around this time that they decide we can have a system of labor wherein we can debase one section of the labor force for the benefit of the other. A historian called Edmund Morgan has made this very important observation. In essence, he says that American freedom, the freedom that everybody enjoys, and I'm sure you can draw parallels to that today, but the freedom that everyone else enjoyed in America, including all the principles that the Declaration of Independence and that the American Revolution was founded on, was based on American slavery. Because without that slavery, without somebody doing the hard work of developing the country, and when I say doing the hard work, I mean somebody had to tear down the trees. Somebody had to build the houses. Somebody had to build the roads. Somebody had to make the flour. Somebody had to to pick the tobacco. Somebody had to work in the rice fields. And that meant that African Americans were basically sacrificed for the freedom of all white Americans. So beginning in around the 1670s, you begin to see all kinds of improvements in the lives of white settlers, while it became, as you were saying, absolutely impossible for African Americans to be free and also to improve their life. So, one way to say this again and very shortly is that American slavery made American freedom possible.
Certainly seems like a point that can't be overemphasized. Do we see then the creation of these categories of blackness and whiteness? Because of course those are not, static categories. Those change over time. Do we see those really changing or forming really in right after like the 1670s, and how does that kind of evolve from then into the 19th century, and of course again in New York and anywhere really in the colonies and then the United States? That's a huge question, I know, but like just in terms of a brief glimpse into that long answer.
I wanted to just jump in while we have this visual here, and part of the visual that you see that are on loop, it shows you, different images of New Amsterdam, 1620s, 30s, 40s, up to 1660. Then you have some various maps that might exist that show you that time period, like the New York City's first 100 years. And one thing that you'll notice is no matter like what museum you go to, no matter what movies you're watching, there's been this very sneaky, subtle way of taking an entire 100 years of New York history, the first century, and making it very obscure. And if you want to have a little bit of extra homework, just try to go find where you can look at a movie or a play or anything that actually begins to slow down and tease out what does it look like to actually live in New York from the very first 100 years. And what you'll notice is that you're moving some very important information off the table, and some of that are the rebellions of 1712, 1741, where once again this character of being rebellious and fighting for your freedom and working together is right here in the streets of New York. We were screening some Black Panther animated episodes last Thursday at our space in the Seaport, and we're like talking about Wakanda and vibranium and just loving the story of Black Panther, but we had to like kind of pause toward the end and say, don't forget, there's people who actually like fought against slavery right here in New York City. We don't have to go and wait for Black Panther to come out to appreciate the real history that are in the streets of New York. And part of what you can begin to appreciate is that you have people prior to the American Revolution, prior to people walking around saying we want freedom from the British, organizing and grabbing arms. There were Black people who were already doing this before it was something that was celebrated. And I think that happened here in a way that doesn't happen in other spaces because it's a very, sought after, valuable port city. And as I'm sorry, you told me to call you Deborah, apologize. As Deborah mentioned, what happened in Virginia, that happens in New York as well. Anybody here know about the 1741 rebellion? Anybody? I see a hand up. It was primarily led by people that were enslaved with awesome names like Caesar and Kofi and Kwaku, and there's people also that were from Ireland who also were angry at the British because they colonized their country. And so you have this interesting mixture of races led primarily by people that were enslaved, but they were all more or less drinking cider and rum at the same tavern, saying, you know what, I don't like the English, you don't like the English. Sorry about that. So what if we got some swords and some guns and just took this place over and burned it down, and then we could change over the power structure? And this was going down like in the 1730s. This is like George Washington's like maybe 2 years old at this time. And so what happened after this particular plan started, you have all these different arsons that are happening. They burned down the governor's mansion. They burned down storehouses. People are terrified. This is going on for like 2 or so weeks in 1741. Once it gets out that there's Black people behind it, they figure, okay, let's turn this into a legit, air quotes, New York City Supreme Court case. And this court case lasted for like 6 months. And part of what happens after this court case is they're discovering that there are poor English, poor Irish, working with enslaved people, plotting to take over New York at a time they're also having a war with the Spanish. And they're like, wait a minute, we can't fight the Spanish and fight enslaved people and fight poor European people all at the same time. And you begin to see this institution of white supremacy begin to come out where they say, you know what, even if you're white and you're poor and you're broke, we have to find a way to make you feel like you're one of us. And that still works to this day. And that plot was really more or less cut here in English New York. It's not something you're going to quite see in the South because there's a lot more chasms between classes and, antebellum, cotton plantation, Republic South. But Republic as far as American as a republic, not trying to throw shade toward parties. But I think it's important to understand how much of that is right here, and it's a part of New York City's character, and that history is available. You can Google it, get the books, but I think it's important that to understand it's also not obvious. People also make sure it's not obvious to find.
Yeah, I was going to ask, in each of your projects, be they books or public history projects, which you've all been involved in, are you looking to kind of new scholarship that has uncovered these histories, but where else are you looking in order to put your tours together, or exhibitions or seminars or classes or new books? How have you helped uncover more of these stories, and what are the remaining challenges to telling these narratives?
Well, I'll start. What I've done is focus on the women. That's what I do. It's my primary, well, I do African American history, but I think that so much of the African American story can be told through the lives of black women. Because however life is experienced, black women, even today, do not experience blackness the same way that black men do. And they didn't during this period as well. Because let's just take one date, and we take the day that the international slave trade ended. That means that by this time, most African Americans, at least, most slaves were coming via the international slave trade, coming from Africa. In 1807, when that trade ends, where are you going to get slaves from? Okay, the increase of the slave population then becomes dependent on African American women to have those children. And so when we talk about New York, I know this is for sure in New Jersey, where I'm presently employed and where I live, and having done work on the history of Rutgers University, right before the Gradual Emancipation Act, and right before women were going to be free. So you have a Gradual Emancipation Act. So basically, you can keep, what is it, in New York, you can keep your slaves up in, you have to free them at what age? At 28. Well, guess what happens? All of a sudden, an awful lot of black women are being sold down to Mississippi. And they're being sold down to Louisiana because if you look also at New York and you look at most urban cities, women who are of childbearing age are not really as desired in urban areas as they are in rural areas. So just think about it. Here you are. You know that, all right, after the Emancipation Act is passed, I can be free once I get to a certain age. But more than likely, what your slave master is going to do, he's going to sell you down to Mississippi. He's going to sell you down to New Orleans. And if he doesn't do that, he might sell you over to New Jersey or certainly out of the city. So one of the things that we look, if you look at so many of the demographics, and more than likely if you look at it in New York, one of the things you're going to find is that you're not going to find an awful lot of young women in the city because most masters don't want women who are young around for a couple of reasons. They don't want them having their children, and because space is very tight. I mean, if you look at here, you're not going to want young black women for other kinds of reasons, including sexual relations that they might have with either other servants in the house or with the master, etc. So, to get to your question, if you do a gendered analysis, and if you put a gendered analysis on top of your racial analysis, you come up with some things that you may never have, that you really, quite frankly, hadn't thought about before. And just one more thing, if you also do it age-wise, what happens to elderly black people in a city like New York or in any northern urban city, in any city whatsoever? Because masters don't want to keep them around because there's no place, if they can't do work in the house, then what are they going to do? And basically, sometimes they just turn them out. So you're going to see an awful lot of poverty, and if you see poverty, more than likely with African Americans, it's going to be elderly people. And sometimes they're just put out to die.
So in terms of how we do public history and how we bring this history out of textbooks, out of classrooms in which people are falling asleep, and actually to the public. I think one of the best ways to do it is to start asking within your communities and within your families. And as I'm getting older, I know I'm doing a whole lot of digging around my own family and asking my elders sort of, what do you remember about this history? Because they're often the best people to tell you exactly what happened in the city streets and exactly what happened in our communities. So I would urge you, 3 things. If you're still in school, ask educators to tell you this history. And if you're out of school, and even if you're not out of school, start speaking to your aunties and your grandmas and start asking them what these stories are. Your grandmas might not be that old, but they can still tell you stuff about your city and about your neighborhoods, which of course are rapidly changing in New York. So just go dig personal and you'll get at all the professional stuff.
I would also encourage people to connect a lot of dots. Sometimes the information is right there in front of your face. It's just about connecting dots and having new insight. People sometimes think that I found some major shoebox that no one else discovered because my insight might be different, but really it's a matter of bringing your perspective. And you could be in this room right now listening to this conversation, and you might find a whole different way of seeing things that no one else would consider. And so I think it's about also activating the common scholar, the person who is a nerdy person who has a love for history. You might read something and connect dots that other people might not have seen or considered. And I like to look at the timeline a lot because it's a way to organize information. But if you look at this moment that is being discussed here as far as the American Revolution and going into the early days of the United States, it's also interesting to consider that during the Revolution here, that the Howard brothers, that were the generals in charge of the British campaign against the Continental Army, they got rid of slavery during the war. And that was one of the first emancipation proclamations, created one of the first great migrations on this, here in this country. Because the British said, hey, if you're a black person, you escape your slave master and you join us and you fight, you're going to be free. And that was in 1776. And in 1777, the Americans followed suit and also began to say, if you fight with us, you can also be free. You might want to guess which side reneged on their promise? Well, we got a British person right here that kept their word. We didn't quite keep our word. And what you have is during that promise of freedom, the population in New York is going to swell. It's going to more or less triple. And during that time period, slavery is kind of not really the main way that New York is being organized. But once the war is over, it's actually, we got to bring slavery back because we have some states in the South that aren't going to go for this idea of being free. And so part of this emancipation or this gradual Emancipation Act is passed by 2 people, John J. Alexander Hamilton, who both are proponents of gradual abolition. And so part of the division between the North and South happens early in the Republic, where people are saying, you know what, you people in New York, where the nation's capital was, our nation's first capital was New York. You have 2 very powerful politicians who are advocating for federalism, a strong central government, and also advocating for abolition. So can you imagine those in the South saying, I don't know how I feel about our nation's capital being up there with you guys. How about we get our nation's capital out of the North? I mean, you have this division of North and South happening from the very beginning of our nation being founded. And the people that are here in New York have memory, wait a minute, we don't want to stick around and just wait for freedom. And then it's also worth knowing, anybody know what the Fugitive Slave Law passed, 1850? Anybody familiar with that? That basically reverses the 1827 law, because now you have slave catchers in New York grabbing people saying, you know what, you don't got papers, we're selling you, just like Deborah said. And so you have a law that basically circumnavigates the other law, creating, once again, the stage for the Civil War.
And then, of course, New York is not necessarily advocating for they're not necessarily fighting slavery out of New York City. There's so many New Yorkers who are integral to the Southern slave trade and cotton, and so those histories continue. And white supremacy in the city continues through the Civil War and after. And
just thinking, since we're going in this kind of chronological direction and we're running out of time, unfortunately, so we'll have to keep the conversation going in many ways after this. I'm just curious what you all think are the legacies of Black communities of early New York, be it up to today, but doesn't have to bring it all the way up to today. I mean, it sounds like we've touched on, how integral Black New Yorkers were to helping build the city, as well as notions of what it means to be a New Yorker and an American in general. The creation of these kind of identities of Blackness and whiteness here and elsewhere, of course. Rebellions, I know we've mentioned. Are there other things that we haven't touched on that we want to kind of lob out there before we close that helps, think about our recent moment, our current moment, really anything?
I think the two words that always spring to mind is the greatest legacy these ancestors gave us were the two words of community and resistance. They were the original people in the North American colonies who came up with those two concepts. And so I think that is a very sort of quintessential New York story, and something, we're using those words a lot today, but yes.
Yeah, I associate myself with those comments. Yes, community and resistance, and I also want to just sort of inspire the room. I'm gonna give it a shot here. If you look at, going back to 1664, you have this continuation of often trying to suppress Black stories, and with the discovery of the African burial ground, early 1990s, you have this moment where we're beginning to realize for almost 2 centuries we had. When I say we, it's kind of that double consciousness thing. We as a country successfully buried the presence and legacy of Black people on this island. And around 1812, when our current city hall was completed, part of what happened when, the Commons became a park then, and then we have our city hall, and for about almost 200 years, people forgot there was a burial ground there, but it was in the map. So people who actually knew the maps and studied New York knew there was a burial ground there. And so we're kind of just beginning of a whole new phase, if you consider for 200 years, this has not been more or less in public consciousness. And so here we are in the first 25 years of this now becoming something that people understand. And so, once again, if you're in middle school and you raise your hand, understand your role in this. I mean, your questions have challenged us to consider and think differently. And also think that if you're in the room right now, we're at the very beginning to expand our understanding of the legacy of Black people in New York, and we're just getting started. We all could be a part of it. I think that's very exciting.
I would say, and I don't want to make it seem sort of a trite statement, but I think that we as a people, African Americans, have always managed to make lemonade out of lemons. And every single time, and I think this is something that we need to remember given our present time, every single time this nation has tried to bury us, has tried to suppress us, has tried to take our rights, we find a way not just to survive, but to thrive. And in our own communities. So if you take segregation, which is a legacy of slavery, you look at Jim Crow. They thought they were pushing us off into these little terrible neighborhoods, but what did we do? We brought in the Harlem Renaissance. We managed to have and find a rebirth out of that. And so, given slavery, which is one of the worst things that they could have done. Some people would say it was not. Some people have actually argued that it was the convict labor system after slavery ended. However, it has been attempted. We have always found a way to thrive and also to move on. And I would remind you that has been the history of African Americans, and that will continue to be the history of African Americans, even in the present situation.
Thank you so much again to all of our panelists and to all of you for being here. Stick around.
Time for 2 questions.
Oh, we do. Great.
So we'll just go around. Okay, a hands up.
Hi. So my question is mostly for Dr. White. Given how integral African Americans have been to the accumulation of wealth in this country, do you think that there's a case for reparations? And if so, what form would that take?
I'm sorry. There is more than a case for reparations. I mean, and all you have to do is look at African American history. There is a case there. Whether or not we will have reparations, you see what happened to affirmative action, right? So I think that, but on a lighter note, I've always thought that one form of reparations would be for every African American to be able to get therapy on demand. So because actually the CDC has actually come out with a new study, which has argued that just the daily grind of having to deal with discrimination is really takes its toll on African Americans. So, well, it's sort of PTSD, but I forget. They call the effect. It's called weathering. It happens slowly. It happens daily. It happens incrementally. It's not. And it's in every single aspect of your life. So my thing would be we should be able to choose our therapist and have therapy for free.
And then any other questions?
Speaking about the early communities in New York, do you think there are any lessons to be learned from the decimation of Seneca Village and what was Little Africa that's now Soho and the Village, for keeping Harlem from becoming the next Seneca Village? Or
somebody asked me once after a conversation like this, he says, why should we build Black Wall Street again? They tore it down. And I was like, yeah, they tore it down once. Not to encourage people to say build something and have it be torn down again, but if you're afraid to build something because it was torn down, then it was a successful tear down. And so I think what's important is to have resiliency, because you see that things get built, torn down, get built, torn down, get built, torn down. I mean, I think that the resiliency is a very important part of the legacy and the spirit that is transferable and is very much a part of the human condition that is exemplified in the Black experience. But I think that the idea that somehow you stop building because things have been taken away, you got to just keep on coming back.
I'm from London, and what strikes me about London and New York is how so many important sites which are associated with Black people happen to also be very expensive real estate. And I just wondered, as historians in the US, if there's been any attempts to really kind of engage with capital around what physically in Canary Wharf, which is next to West India Docks, where all the sugar was brought in, or the African Burial Ground near Wall Street, to actually engage with actually what their physical environment is based on and the history that's there that links to African Americans.
Yeah, there's been increasingly, I would say in the last decade, a lot of work certainly happening here in New York around that very topic. And I would also encourage you guys to think about museums as well as a place of knowledge. So, Leslie Harris's Shadow of Slavery talked about that very thing. What was happening in New York streets and why is it so expensive today, those very neighborhoods? Brooklyn, I'm currently writing something about that very topic, about these gentrifying neighborhoods today, but actually they were sort of sites of great political activity amongst African Americans. So I think it's happening slowly, but I think it's been happening more in scholarly books, and I think that knowledge coming out is also sort of going to happen slower too. But yeah, museums I think are one of the best places to get hold of this information. And I'm trying to think of an exhibit that's currently up, but of course I can't. But Brooklyn Abolitionists at Brooklyn Historical Society and the In Pursuit of Freedom exhibit out at Weeksville Heritage Center are just two examples of thinking about your spaces and what existed there before and the kind of capitalism that drove them.
I think it's also worth just continuing to challenge the public square. It's like a lot more discussion about monuments, what goes up, what comes down. I'm glad to hear about, Marion Sims statue coming down. So snap clap to everybody who pushed for that to happen.
Which
but I
will
think
be doing
that
some programming at the museum for that, so look out.
what was that shout out?
We will be doing some programming around that. At
Awesome,
the
because
museum,
it was
look out
close
for
to
that.
right here. But I think it's important to challenge the public square because one thing that I consider, like that little girl that challenged me in 2008 is young people are looking into the world to see their reflection, to understand who they are, and they feel their power. They feel, the power of youth and imagination. They're very curious, and they look around the world and they see like these streets, by like their names, like the statues, doesn't reflect who they are or their values. And so I think that we can't look at the public square as this unbeatable giant. It's the same way that things start off in publications, in books, in classes, and then that kind of cements these mythologies that we then accept as truth. We can just undo that whole process on both sides and begin to make the public square more reflective of true information, real conversation, real understanding, because that's such an important part of the conversation where we feel like ourselves. We should walk down the street and not see, oppressive symbols that, make people feel awkward in their own bodies. Back to the whole need for therapy. That's part of what happens is sometimes the world itself comes after you, and we have to begin to challenge it.
I think that's a beautiful place to end.
Thank you so much again to our three panelists and to all of you. And so we're gonna break, and then this room will transform, right? Okay. So stay tuned. Thanks again.
Check, check. Just for some more information on your way out, I'm going to give it to Dominique.
Hi, everyone. Can we have one more round of applause for our amazing panel, our amazing panelists? So during this panel, it was mentioned that one of the best places to connect the dots of Black history is at a museum like this one. And in order to help you do that, we've arranged for a scavenger hunt that gets you inside the galleries here, looking at pieces of Black history, ranging from objects from the earliest New Yorkers, the earliest Black New Yorkers in colonial New York, all the way up to contemporary artists like Kara Walker upstairs. So there's information about that scavenger hunt right outside these doors. We also, in our classrooms at the end of the hall, will be having programs and workshops put on by the Studio Museum. So please feel free to get down there and get your hands in some projects and workshops. We're going to ask for everyone to clear the space while we prepare for the community fair, and then come back in about half an hour or so, and we'll get started. So scavenger hunt, workshops, get to know each other, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.